I'm Zach Johnson, also known as the Millennial Farmer.
They didn't grow up around agriculture, they don't understand a lot about it, and now they can see it from an inside view.
The biggest thing I would hope to get across is just highlight the fact that farmers are people, and we are still...
Most people who stumble across a tractor video on YouTube have no idea they're watching one of the most unlikely success stories in the platform's history. They see a guy in a seed cap climbing into a combine, talking about moisture levels and planting depth, and they scroll past without a second thought. What they don't see is a farmer who never once set out to be famous, a wife who taught herself video editing at the kitchen table after midnight, and a decade-long chain of decisions that turned a frustrated response to online criticism into one of the largest agricultural media businesses in the country. This is the story of Zach Johnson, the man behind Millennial Farmer, and how a single camera on a dusty oil drum ended up reshaping his entire life. Zach Johnson grew up on a family farm in Lowry, a small town in west-central Minnesota, as part of a farming operation that had already been passed down across multiple generations. Long before anyone talked about subscriber counts or ad revenue, the rhythm of his life was set by planting windows, harvest deadlines, and whatever the Minnesota weather decided to throw at him that week. Farming was not a backup plan or a side project. It was simply what the Johnson family did, season after season, on the same corn and soybean ground near Lowry. By the time Zach reached adulthood, he was farming alongside his father, working thousands of acres of corn and soybeans, and living the kind of life that almost never gets any outside attention. Rural Minnesota does not generate headlines very often, and farmers rarely get asked to explain themselves to a national audience. That was fine with Zach. He had no interest in cameras, no background in video production, and no plan to build any kind of public profile. He just wanted to keep the operation running the way his family had run it for generations. Like a lot of farm kids, Zach grew up around machinery, livestock, and the kind of physical labor that most people only see in movies. His family's roots on that land stretched back generations, with ancestors who had immigrated to the region from Sweden and built a life around the same soil Zach would eventually work himself. That kind of history creates a particular sense of responsibility. When your family name has been attached to a piece of ground for that long, the pressure to keep it going isn't something anyone has to say out loud. It's just understood. What changed that path was not a business plan. It was frustration. By the spring of 2016, Zach had grown tired of watching farming get misrepresented online. Conversations about GMOs, pesticides, and modern agricultural practices were everywhere, but almost none of them featured an actual farmer explaining what was really happening in the field. Farmers were routinely painted as indifferent to the environment, even though they were drinking from the same wells and swimming in the same lakes that sat downstream from their own fields. Zach decided that arguing in comment sections was pointless. Instead of typing out another reply that nobody would read, he set his phone down on an old oil drum in the corner of his shed and started talking. There was no script, no lighting setup, and no editing plan. The idea was simple. Film the actual process of planting a crop from beginning to end, all the way through harvest, so people could see for themselves what modern farming looked like instead of relying on secondhand arguments. He uploaded it to a new channel and called it Millennial Farmer. The first real payout from that experiment was $92. It sounds almost like a punchline today, but at the time it was proof of something Zach had not expected. Strangers on the internet were actually interested in watching a real farmer talk about real fields. That tiny check from YouTube did not change his life on its own, but it planted the idea that this could be more than a one-time experiment. Growth in the early years was slow and steady, the kind of pace you would expect from a channel with no marketing budget and no professional production behind it. Then, during the 2017 harvest season, something shifted. A video showing the reality of harvest work started pulling in far more attention than anything before it. Massive combines rolling through real fields, filmed by the person actually operating them, turned out to be strangely captivating for viewers who had never spent a single day near a farm. Subscriber numbers climbed quickly after that. What had been a channel with a modest following jumped into the tens of thousands almost overnight. For the first time, it became clear that the audience for this kind of content was not limited to other farmers. City and suburban viewers, people who had never thought twice about where their food came from, were tuning in because the videos offered something they had never seen before, an honest, unscripted look inside an industry that touches every single person but remains almost invisible to most consumers. By the end of the following year, the channel had blown past every early expectation Zach had set for it. What started as a way to answer online critics had turned into one of the fastest-growing farming channels on the platform, and it was still being run almost entirely by two people working out of their own home. One video in particular became the moment a lot of people point to when they talk about the channel's breakout. Titled simply "Tractor Stuck in the Mud," it showed exactly what the name promised: a tractor sinking into wet ground during a routine job, followed by the unglamorous, sometimes funny process of getting it out. Zach later credited the video's popularity to the fact that it had a clean, natural 3-act structure built right into the situation: a setup, a conflict, and a resolution, without anyone having to script a single line of it. That video went on to become one of the most viewed uploads on the entire channel, pulling in well over 1 million views and introducing an enormous new audience to the Millennial Farmer name almost overnight. It also became something of a lesson for Zach about what kind of content actually resonated. Viewers didn't want polish. They wanted to see a real problem get solved by someone who genuinely knew what he was doing, mistakes and all. Zach Johnson may be the face most people recognize, but very little of the Millennial Farmer operation would exist without his wife, Becky Johnson. Before the channel took off, Becky had no background in video editing, social media management, or running a media business. She learned all of it the hard way, largely through trial and error, while also raising a family and helping keep the household running during the busiest stretches of the farming calendar. The arrangement came out of pure necessity rather than any grand plan. Farm days during planting and harvest can start before sunrise and stretch well into the night, leaving almost no time for Zach to sit down and edit hours of raw footage. Someone had to take over the parts of the business that happened after the camera stopped rolling, and that responsibility fell to Becky. Night after night, she reviewed footage, cut it into something watchable, wrote descriptions, built thumbnails, and got each video ready to publish, all while managing a household with young children in it. Over time, her role expanded far beyond editing. She took on the channel's finances, negotiated sponsorship deals, and built out a social media presence across multiple platforms, all without any formal training in business or marketing. What began as helping her husband with a hobby gradually turned into a full-time job running the operational side of one of the most recognized agricultural brands on the internet. Zach has been open in interviews about how much of the channel's staying power comes directly from Becky's work behind the scenes, describing the whole venture as something the two of them built together rather than something he did alone. All of this happened while the couple was also raising 4 children, including a niece the family welcomed and raised alongside their biological kids. Anyone who has tried to juggle a demanding job with young children at home knows how difficult that balancing act can be even in the best circumstances. Zach and Becky were doing it while also running a farm and building a media company essentially from scratch, with no roadmap and no one else in their community who had gone through the same thing before them. Becky has said in interviews that neither of them could have imagined, even in their wildest guesses, that a farming vlog would turn into what it eventually became. Both had grown up in modest circumstances in rural Minnesota, and the idea that a camera and an internet connection could reshape their family's financial future was not something either of them saw coming when they filmed that first video. As the subscriber count kept climbing, the Millennial Farmer brand stopped looking like a hobby and started looking like an actual media company. YouTube advertising revenue became one part of the income, but it was far from the only one. Sponsorship deals with companies connected to agriculture, equipment, and farm services became a regular part of the business, with brands eager to reach an audience of engaged, loyal viewers who trusted Zach's voice on farming topics. Merchandise followed, giving fans a way to support the channel directly. A podcast called Off the Husk launched in 2019, backed by a major agricultural sponsor, giving Zach and Becky another way to reach listeners who wanted longer, more conversational discussions about farming, technology, and everyday life on the operation. None of this replaced the actual farm. Zach continued farming alongside his father, who kept the day-to-day operation running even as media commitments pulled at Zach's schedule more and more each year. But the diversification meant the Johnsons were no longer dependent on a single source of income, and by their own account in interviews, the YouTube side of the business grew into something that outpaced what many would have expected from a farming operation alone. What makes the story unusual is not just the money. It's how directly the online success came from doing the opposite of what most viral creators do. Zach didn't chase trends, use clickbait titles, or manufacture drama. He filmed the actual work, including the failures. Stuck tractors, equipment breakdowns, bad weather, and rough harvests all stayed in the videos instead of getting edited out. And that honesty became the entire foundation of the channel's appeal. In December 2019, tragedy struck a family living only about 20 miles from Zach's own farm. 3 family members, including an 11-year-old boy, died after being overcome by fumes while working inside a silo near Millerville, Minnesota. Local volunteer firefighters attempted a rescue, but did not have the specialized equipment needed to reach them safely in time. The loss devastated the surrounding farming community, and it hit uncomfortably close to home for Zach, who understood firsthand how common and how dangerous grain bin and silo accidents had become across the upper Midwest. Minnesota and North Dakota were already among the states with the highest rates of grain bin-related deaths in the country, and Zach had recently watched 2 neighbors get pulled out of a bin in a separate incident. The pattern was clear. Rural fire departments across the region were being asked to respond to some of the most dangerous emergencies in agriculture without the training or equipment to do it safely. Rather than simply making a video about the tragedy and moving on, Zach and Becky decided to use the platform they had built to actually change the outcome for other families. They started a fundraising campaign aimed at equipping volunteer fire departments with proper grain bin rescue equipment and training. Using live streams, videos, and the reach of their existing audience, the campaign brought in roughly $60,000, which went toward equipping dozens of fire departments across more than a dozen states with rescue tools they previously did not have. That effort eventually grew into a registered nonprofit called Harvest Outreach, which continues to review requests from rural departments and distribute safety equipment and training resources to this day. It is worth pointing out how unusual this pivot was for a creator in Zach's position. Plenty of influencers build large audiences and stop there. Zach and Becky took the attention their farming videos had earned and redirected a meaningful share of it toward a public safety problem that had nothing to do with growing their subscriber count and everything to do with preventing another family from going through what their neighbors had just experienced. Harvest Outreach didn't stop at grain bin rescue equipment. Over the following years, the nonprofit expanded to fund college scholarships for students pursuing agriculture-related degrees, partnering with outside organizations to make that possible. In 2022, Zach also became personally involved with Farm Rescue, a separate organization that sends volunteers to help farm families who are dealing with injury, illness, or natural disaster during planting or harvest season. He assisted with his first farm rescue case that year in Raymond, Minnesota, and has continued to use his platform to raise awareness for the group's work ever since. None of this generated the same kind of view counts as a video about a stuck tractor. It simply mattered more, and Zach has said as much in interviews, describing the safety work as one of the most meaningful things to come out of the channel's success. As the channel grew, so did the demands on Zach's time. Sponsorship calls, filming schedules, podcast recordings, and public speaking engagements began competing directly with the hours he had once spent entirely in the field. His father continued running large parts of the day-to-day farm operation, often picking up extra responsibility whenever media commitments pulled Zach away. It created a workable balance, but it also meant Zach was living 2 lives that did not always fit neatly together. The farmer his family had raised him to be, and the public figure the internet had turned him into almost by accident. Zach has spoken candidly in interviews about how strange this transition felt. Nobody in his family history had ever needed to think about algorithm changes or platform policies. Yet those factors now had a real influence on the future of a business built on land that had been farmed for generations. Farmland does not disappear overnight. a YouTube channel's reach can shift dramatically with very little warning. That tension between old-fashioned stability and new-fashioned uncertainty became part of the story too, even if it rarely showed up directly in the videos themselves. What ultimately set Millennial Farmer apart from other agricultural content wasn't just the footage of tractors and harvests. It was the audience it managed to build. A significant share of the channel's viewers turned out to have no connection to farming at all. City and suburban viewers who had never set foot on a working farm kept coming back, drawn in by the simple curiosity of wanting to understand where their food actually comes from. That shift changed what the channel represented. It stopped being just another farmer talking to other farmers and became something closer to a bridge between two groups of people who rarely interacted directly: the people growing the country's food and the people eating it. Videos covering topics like GMOs, pesticide use, and modern farm equipment gave viewers a plain language explanation instead of the polarized arguments that usually dominate those conversations online. Zach's approach was rarely to argue with critics directly. Instead, he showed the actual process and let viewers draw their own conclusions, an approach that built an unusual level of trust with an audience that might otherwise have been skeptical of anything coming from inside the agriculture industry. Zach has also made a point of showing sides of his life that go beyond fieldwork. He has spoken publicly about interests outside the farm, including a long-time passion for shooting sports, which led him to co-own a local shooting park in Minnesota, and a love of dirt track racing that eventually became the focus of the family's second channel. Viewers who might have started out watching purely for tractor footage often found themselves sticking around for the personality behind the camera. A farmer with a dry, understated sense of humor who treated failures and successes with roughly the same amount of composure. That consistency, video after video, year after year, is a big part of why the audience kept growing instead of drifting away the way so many YouTube followings eventually do. The channel's growth over the following years continued at a pace that would have seemed impossible back when Zach was filming spring planting on his phone. By the mid-2020s, Millennial Farmer had crossed well past 1 million subscribers and hundreds of millions of lifetime views, making it one of the most watched farming channels anywhere on the platform. Off the Husk continued as a companion podcast, and Zach and Becky added a second channel focused on family life and Zach's dirt track racing hobby, giving longtime viewers a different side of their lives beyond the fields. In September 2024, timed deliberately around National Farm Safety and Health Week, a major agricultural publication recognized Zach as one of its honorees for individuals making a meaningful difference in the industry, citing both his online platform and his continued work through harvest outreach. The recognition came the same year Zach turned 40, marking roughly 8 years since that first uncertain upload from the shed. Then, in May 2026, the channel reached a milestone that very few creators in any category ever managed to hit: 10 full years online. Regional Public Radio in Minnesota covered the anniversary as a genuinely rare achievement in an online content landscape where most channels burn out long before reaching double digits. From a $92 payout to a decade of sustained growth, safety fundraising, and a media business built entirely on showing real, unscripted farm life, the Millennial Farmer story stands as one of the more unlikely and enduring successes to come out of YouTube's early years. Strip away the subscriber counts and the sponsorship deals, and what's left is a much simpler story about two people who responded to frustration by choosing honesty over arguing, and who kept choosing honesty even after the cameras started paying real bills. Zach Johnson never set out to become an internet personality, and Becky Johnson never set out to run a media company. They ended up doing both because a demanding, unpredictable farming life left no other option, and because an audience of millions turned out to be hungry for exactly the kind of unfiltered, everyday honesty that a phone propped on an oil drum could offer. 10 years later, the tractors are still stuck in the mud sometimes. The harvest still runs late some seasons, and the farm his family has worked for generations is still the center of it all. The camera just happens to be rolling now, and somewhere along the way, that decision ended up saving lives, funding rescue equipment for dozens of fire departments, and giving millions of people a genuine window into a part of American life they had never seen before.